Hello brothers and sisters, and welcome to another episode of my History of Islam series. Episode 5. So today, we're going to focus on more of the expansion of jihad in the 12th and 13th centuries. I hope you all enjoy. God bless you all. Glory to God. Pope Urban II called the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont in 1095, saying that without military action, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by Muslim forces. For your brethren who live in the East are in urgent need of your help, and you must hasten to give them the aid which has often been promised them. For as most of you have heard, the Turks and Arabs have attacked them, have conquered the territory of Romania, as far west as the shore of the Mediterranean, and the Hellespont, which is called the Arm of St. George. They have occupied more and more of the lands of those Christians, and have overcome them in 7 battles. They have killed and captured many, and have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. If you permit them to continue this for a while with impunity, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by them. On this account I, or rather the Lord, beseech you as Christ's heralds, to publish this everywhere, and to persuade all people of whatever rank, foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians, and to destroy that vile race from the lands of our friends. Moreover, Christ commands it. The Pope spoke of an imminent peril, threatening you and all the faithful, which has brought us hither. From the confines of Jerusalem, from the city of Constantinople, a grievous report has gone forth, and has repeatedly been brought to our ears, namely that a race from the kingdom of the Persians, an accursed race, a race wholly alienated from God, a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God, violently invaded the lands of those Christians, and has depopulated them by pillage and fire. They have led away a part of the captives into their own country, and a part they have killed by cruel tortures. They have either destroyed the churches of God, or appropriated them for the rites of their own religion. They destroy the altars after having defiled them with their uncleanness. The kingdom of the Greeks is now dismembered by them, and has been deprived of territories over vast in extent that it could be traversed in 2 months' time. This royal city, however, situated at the centre of the earth, is now held captive by the enemies of Christ, and is subjugated by those who do not know God to the worship of the heathen. She seeks, therefore, and desires to be liberated, and ceases not to implore you to come to her aid. From you especially she asks succour, because, as we have already said, God has conferred upon you, above all other nations, great glory and arms. He invoked the Muslim destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Crusades initially came together as pilgrimages. Crusaders embarked on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, intending to defend themselves if attacked. Many took religious vows. Indeed, the first Crusader foray into Muslim lands, the so-called People's Crusade, was more religious revival meeting than military force. It began with preaching, as a charismatic preacher known as Peter the Hermit traversed France and Germany. As Peter preached, he began to attract followers, women and children, as well as soldiers. The People's Crusaders crossed Europe and arrived in Constantinople in 1096, by then 30,000 strong. Entering the domains of the Turks, they were quickly massacred near Nicaea, while Peter the Hermit was still in Constantinople discussing strategy with Alexis Comnenus. The principal Crusader force of actual military men had not yet even arrived in the region. As the People's Crusaders crossed Europe, Peter the Hermit became famous and attracted imitators. Many of these new Crusade leaders, however, were not interested primarily in defending the Christians in the Middle East, but in lining their own pockets at the expense of the Jews of Germany. In Mainz, forces under the command of Count Amico of Leiningen found the Jews under the protection of the local bishop, who had heard that they were coming, and brought the Jews in the area into his palace. Undeterred, these crusaders stormed the bishop's palace and massacred the Jews inside it. 11th century historian of the First Crusade, Albert of Aix, recounted that they killed the women also, and with their swords pierced tender children of whatever age and sex. A crusader explained this thinking to a rabbi. You are the children of those who killed the object of our veneration, hanging him on a tree, and he himself had said, there will yet come a day when children will come and avenge my blood. There is no record of Jesus Christ ever saying such a thing. The Crusader massacres of Jews in Europe was not only an outrageous crime, but a disastrous miscalculation. Had the warriors of jihad succeeded in Europe, they would have subjugated the Christians and the Jews in the same way. Had the Crusaders traversed Europe, inviting help from the Jews rather than killing them, the Crusaders might have arrived in the Middle East far stronger, and the history of the world would have been different in incalculable ways. But this was not by any means the only time in the history of jihad warfare that the Muslims benefited from disunity, and in fighting among those who stood between them and their goal. The Muslims were disunited as well. The 13th century Muslim historian Al-Wathir even recorded speculation that the Crusaders had come only at the bidding of the Fatimid Shiites in order to disrupt the growth of the Sunni Seljuk Turkish domains. According to Al-Wathir, as the Crusaders approached Antioch, the Muslim mullah of Antioch at the time, Yaghi Sayan, demonstrated for future historians that he knew exactly what the conflict was about, and it wasn't about land or treasure. He feared possible sedition on the part of the Christians of the city. He therefore decided to expel them. It was to no avail. Antioch fell to the Crusaders, who, lacking adequate food supplies, proceeded to nearby Ma'ara to secure them. Al-Wathir said that for 3 days they put people to the sword, killing more than 100,000 people, taking many prisoners. This is impossible, as Ma'ara likely was home to no more than 10,000 people. But jihad preachers will already find the exaggeration of atrocity stories, casualty figures, to be a useful tool in recruitment efforts. The Crusaders, meanwhile, were not finished there. Not finding the stores of food they had hoped to find, increasingly desperate, they fell to cannibalism. The 12th century Frankish chronicler Rudolf of Korn recounted, in Mara, troops boiled pagan adults in cooking pots, then impaled children on spits and devoured them grilled. A coterie of leading crusaders reported less graphically to the Pope. A terrible famine racked the army in Mara and placed it in the cruel necessity, feeding itself upon the bodies of the Saracens, exclaimed Albert of Aix. Not only did our troops not shrink from eating dead Turks and Saracens, they also ate dogs. This ghastly event spread far and wide in Muslim lands, contributing to the popular image of the Crusaders among Muslims that was enunciated by the 12th century chronicler Ibn Muqdi. All those who were well informed about the Franj saw them as beasts, superior in courage and fighting ardour, but in nothing else, just as animals are superior in strength and aggression. Even had the horrific events in Mara never taken place, however, it would have been difficult for the Crusaders to make a better impression. The characterization of non-Muslims as akin to animals was not original to Ibn Muqdi. It could be found in the Quran itself. In chapter 8, verse 55, for the worst of beasts in sight of Allah are those who reject him, they will not believe. In any case, the Crusaders scarcely behaved better as they continued their conquest. After a 5-week siege, the Crusaders entered Jerusalem in July 1099. An anonymous contemporary account by a Christian recounted what happened next. One of our knights, Litholdus by name, climbed onto the wall of the city. When he reached the top, all the defenders of the city quickly fled along the walls and through the city. Our men followed and pursued them, killing and hacking as far as the Temple of Solomon. And there was such a slaughter that our men were up to their ankles in the enemy's blood. The emir, who commanded the Tower of David, surrendered to the count and opened the gate where pilgrims used to pay tribute. Entering the city, our pilgrims pursued and killed the Saracens up to the Temple of Solomon. There the Saracens assembled and resisted fiercely all day, so that the whole temple flowed with their blood. At last the pagans were overcome, and our men seized many men and women in the temple, killing them or keeping them alive as they saw fit. On the roof of the temple there was a great crowd of pagans of both sexes, to whom Tancred and Gaston de Bert gave their banners. Then the Crusaders scattered throughout the city, seizing gold and silver, horses and mules, and houses full of all sorts of goods. Afterwards our men went rejoicing and weeping for joy, to adore the sepulchre of our Saviour Jesus, and there discharge their debt to him. 3 principal crusade leaders, Archbishop Daimbert, Godfrey Duke of Bouillon, and Raymond, Count of Toulouse, boasted to the Pope in September 1099 about the Crusaders' Jerusalem exploits. Balderic, a bishop and the author of an early 12th century history of Jerusalem, reported that the Crusaders killed between 20,000 and 30,000 people in the city. The story of this massacre has grown over the centuries. Around 1160, 2 Syrian chroniclers, Al-Wazimi and Al-Qalanisi, wrote separately of this sack. Azimi said only that the Crusaders turned to Jerusalem and conquered it from the hands of the Egyptians. Godfrey took it. They burned the church of the Jews. Al-Qalanisi added a bit more detail. The Franks stormed the town and gained possession of it. Numbers of townsfolk fled to the sanctuary, and a great host were killed. The Jews assembled in the synagogue, and the Franks burned it over their heads. The sanctuary was surrendered to them on guarantee of safety of this year, and they destroyed the shrines and the tomb of Abraham. Al-Jawzi, writing about 100 years after the event, said that the Crusaders killed more than 70,000 Muslims in Jerusalem. Ibn al-Athir recounted, the population of the holy city was put to the sword, and the Franks spent a week massacring Muslims. They killed more than 70,000 people in Al-Aqsa. The 15th century historian Tagliabue recorded 100,000. Former US President Clinton claimed in November 2001 that the Crusaders murdered not just every Muslim warrior or even every Muslim male, but every woman and child who was Muslim on the Temple Mount, so the blood was run up to their knees. The Crusaders' cruelty was not unique for the savage warfare of the period, but that does not excuse it. The cannibalism at Mara has largely been forgotten in the West, but the sack of Jerusalem and the burn of the Jews inside their synagogue was not. The Crusaders' savagery in Jerusalem in 1099 was, according to journalist Amin Maalouf, in the Crusades for Arabis, the starting point of millennial hostility between Islam and the West. Islamic scholar Esposito declares 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence elapsed before political events and papal power play led to centuries-long series of so-called holy wars that pitted Christendom against Islam, left an enduring legacy of misunderstanding and distrust. We have already seen how false these statements are. Islam, as the jihad in Spain, France, Italy and Asia Minor show, was hostile to the West from its inception. There is no peaceful coexistence, there were only brief periods in between jihad invasions. Christian overtures to establish a lasting peace accord were invariably answered by repetition of the triple choice: conversion, submission or war. To describe 1,000 years of hostility between Islam and the West of the Crusaders was to fall prey to the peculiar modern Western malady of civilizational self-loathing and blaming the West for all the ills in the world. Yet the Crusaders' record is by no means spotless, no one's is. Wars never allow one side to claim all the moral high ground. The sins of the Crusaders, however, are taken today to be so very great, and the Crusaders' very mission so imperialistic, colonialist and wrong-headed, that those who view the period of the Crusades with unalloyed pride are hard to find. This shame, however, is itself a relatively new development. As recently at the middle of the 20th century, schools all over the US called their sports teams Crusaders. Students were aware that defence against the jihad was noble and worthwhile, even if all those who participated in it weren't. That was when the West was made of sterner stuff. After the conquest of Antioch and Jerusalem, the poet Al-Khayyat lamented the devastation the Crusaders had wrought and exhorted Muslims to respond. Initially, the response was not overwhelming. The Crusaders met with a great deal of success at first and established 4 states of their own in quick succession: the county of Edessa and the principality of Antioch in 1098, the kingdom of Jerusalem in 1099, and the county of Tripoli in 1104. Collectively, they were known in Europe as Otrama, the lands beyond the sea. The Crusaders' original intention was not to establish states. Pope Urban II decreed that lands recovered from the Muslims would belong to Electus Comnenus and the Byzantine Empire, not to the Western Europeans who conquered them. He envisioned the First Crusade as an act of Christian charity and sacrifice, hence the common parlance that a warrior joining the crusade was taking up the cross. Some of the Crusaders saw their struggle in the same way. Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, one of the more prominent European lords who took up the cross, sold off many properties in order to finance his trip, but he clearly planned to come home rather than settle in the Holy Land, as he didn't give up his title or all of his holdings. When the Crusade leaders met with Alexius Comnenus, he prevailed upon them to agree individually, in accord with Urban's wishes, that any lands they conquered would revert to the Byzantine Empire. But as the Crusaders' siege of Antioch dragged on through the winter and Muslim armies advanced north from Jerusalem, the Crusaders waited for the promised Byzantine troops to arrive. The Emperor, however, received a report that the Crusaders' situation in Antioch was hopeless and turned back his forces. They felt betrayed and reneged on their early agreement to return the lands they won to Byzantine rule. Although they existed in a state of more or less constant war, the Crusader states managed to allow many of their citizens to go about living normal lives. In the 1180s, a Muslim from Al-Andalus, Jubayr, visited the Crusader domains on his way to Mecca. To his dismay, he found that Muslims were living better in the Crusader lands than they were in the neighbouring Islamic areas. Upon leaving Tibenin, we passed through an unbroken skein of farms and villages whose lands were efficiently cultivated. The inhabitants were all Muslims, but they lived in comfort with the Franj. May God preserve them from temptation. Their dwellings belonged to them and all their property is unmolested. All the regions controlled by the Franj in Syria are subject to this same system. The landed domains, villages and farms have remained in the hands of the Muslims. Now doubt invests the heart of a great number of these men when they compare their lot to that of their brothers living in Muslim territory. Indeed, the latter suffer from the injustice of their co-religionists, whereas the Franj act with equity. To preserve Muslims from this temptation, the jihad to destroy these entities began immediately after they were established. The Principality of Antioch fell to the warriors of jihad in 1268, the county of Tripoli in 1289, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1291. The first Crusader state that was established in Odessa was the first to go. The Turkish jihad leader Imad ad-Din Zengi of Mosul laid siege to Odessa in 1144 and conquered it after a 4-month siege. The Syrian bishop Basil was present as the victors plundered the Crusaders' churches. Everything was taken from them: gold, silver, holy vases, chalices, patens, ornamented crucifixes, and great quantities of jewels. The priests, nobles, and notables were taken aside, stripped of their robes, and led away in chains to Aleppo. Of the rest, the artisans were identified, and Zangi kept them as prisoners, setting each to work at his craft. All the others found, about 100 men, were executed. The Crusader advance had been definitively halted, making Zangi a hero of Islam. Inscription at Aleppo hailed him as the tame of the infidels and the polytheists, leader of those who fought the Holy War, help of the armies, protector of the territory of the Muslims. Al-Wathir hailed Zangi in extravagant terms, attributing it all to the invention of Allah, as the Quran does regarding the Battle of Badr. Allah may have used Zengi for his own purposes, yet he was not always a model of piety. One night, not long after he conquered Odessa, he drank a large quantity of wine, fell asleep, only to be awakened to the sight of one of his Frankish slaves, Yarankash, sneaking some wine from Zengi's own goblet. Enraged, he vowed to punish the slave in the morning, fell asleep again, whereupon Yarankash, thoroughly frightened at the prospect of his master's wrath, stabbed him multiple times and fled. The death of Zengi did not blunt the renewed momentum of the jihad. Pope Eugene III, in December 1145, called for a second crusade, and an army was amassed, but it was soundly defeated by the Turks in Asia Minor. They have even got close to achieving its objective of recapturing Odessa. Zengi's son, Nur Eddin, worked hard to revive the spirit jihad among the Muslims, using a combination of threats and enticements. One emir, who received his call to aid him in jihad against the Franks, complained, "If I do not rush to Nur al-Din's aid, he will strip me of my domain, for he has already written to the devotees and ascetics to request the aid of their prayers and to encourage them to incite the Muslims to jihad. At this very moment, each of these men sits with his disciples and companions, reading Nur al-Din's letters, weeping and cursing me. If I am to avoid anathema, I must accede to his request." And like his father, Nur al-Din was strict in his observance of Islam. Not only did he not partake of alcohol, he forbade it to his troops as well, along with, in the words of the chronicler al-Din, the tambourine, the flute, and other objects displeasing to God. He also abandoned luxurious garments and instead covered himself with rough cloth. Before battles he would pray, "God grant victory to Islam and not to Muhammad," his given name. Who is this dog Muhammad to merit victory? Appealing to a rival Turkish commander amid ongoing disputes between rival Muslim forces, Nur ad-Din again demonstrated his piety. His forces captured Damascus from Muslim rivals in 1154. The Crusaders, however, were by no means a spent force, at least not yet. Realising the feebleness of the Shiite Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo, King Almaric of the Kingdom of Jerusalem led troops into Egypt in 1164, where he faced the forces of Shirkuh, the general whom Nur ad-Din had sent to seize the Fatimid domains for himself. Hoping to relieve the pressure on Shirkuh, Nur ad-Din moved quickly toward Antioch and defeated a large Crusader army in the outskirts of the great city. It was a standoff. Almaric agreed to withdraw from Egypt if Shirkuh would do as well, and so it was done. But the great game was not over. 1167, Nur ad-Din sent Shirkuh into Egypt again. By this time, the Fatimid Caliph was just a figurehead like his Sunni Abbasid counterpart. The real ruler of Egypt was Shawar, whom Nur ad-Din had sent into Egypt only to see him turn against his patron. Shawar appealed to Almaric for help. The Crusaders again entered Egypt, and Shawar agreed to pay an annual tribute to the Christians for protection against Nur ad-Din. However, this arrangement was not to last either. When Shirkuh died in 1169, his nephew assumed his authority and defeated a combined force of Crusaders and Byzantines at Damietta in Egypt. The Crusaders were driven from Egypt, and Shirkuh's nephew was only beginning to take the jihad to them, to roll back what they'd gained. The Crusaders faced other foes as well. In 1175, the King of Germany and Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa sent an envoy to Egypt and Syria, who reported back to him about a strange and dangerous Shiite Muslim sect, the Naziri Ismailis, commonly known as the Assassins. With their planned murders of many of the individual opponents, the Assassins gave the English language its word for one who commits planned premeditated murder, and foreshadowed the individual jihad terror attacks of the 21st century. Barbarossa's envoy wrote, "Note that on the confines of Damascus, Antioch and Aleppo, there is a certain race of Saracens in the mountains, who in their own vernacular are called Assassini, in Roman, Signos de Montana, elders of the mountains. This breed of men live without law. They eat swine's flesh against the law of the Saracens, and make use of all women without distinction, including their mothers and sisters. They live in the mountains and are well nigh impregnable, for they withdraw into well-fortified castles. The country is not very fertile, so that they live on their cattle. They have among them a master who strikes the greatest fear into all the Saracen princes, both far and near, as well as the neighbouring Christian lords, for he has the habit of killing them in an astonishing way. The method by which this is done is as follows. This prince possesses in the mountains numerous and most beautiful palaces, surrounded by very high walls, so that none can enter except by a small and well-guarded door. In these palaces he has many of the sons of his peasants brought up from early childhood. He has taught them various languages, as Latin, Greek, Roman, Saracen, as well as many others. These young men are taught by their teachers from their earliest youth to their full manhood that they must obey the lord of their land in all his words and commands, and that if they do so, he, who has power over all living gods, will give them the joys of paradise. They are also taught that they cannot be saved if they resist his will in anything. Note that from the time when they are taken in as children, they see no one but their teachers and masters, and receive no other instruction till they are summoned to the presence of the prince to kill someone. When they are in the presence of the prince, he asks them if they are willing to obey his command, so that he may bestow paradise upon them. Whereupon, as they have been instructed, and without any objection or doubt, they throw themselves at his feet and reply with fervour that they will obey him in all things that he may command. Thereupon the prince gives each one of them a golden dagger, sends them out to kill whichever prince is marked down. Several years later, Archbishop William of Tyre wrote a history of the Crusades, in which he included this. There is in the province of Tyre, otherwise called Phoenician, in the diocese of Tortosa, a people who possess 10 strong castles, with their dependent villages. Their number, according to what we have often heard, is about 60,000 or more. It is their custom to install their master and choose their chief, not by hereditary right, but solely by virtue of merit. Disdaining any other title of dignity, they called him the elder. The bond of submission and obedience that binds this people to their chief is so strong that there is no task so arduous, difficult or dangerous that any one of them would not undertake to perform it with the greatest zeal as soon as the chief has commanded it. If, for example, there be a prince who is hated or mistrusted by this people, the chief gives the dagger to one or more of his followers. At once, whoever receives the command sets out on his mission without considering the consequence of the deed, nor the possibility of escape. Zealous to complete the task, he toils and labours as long as may be needful, till chance gives him the opportunity to carry out his chief's orders. Both our people and the Saracens call them assassini. We do not know the origin of this name. We do. The word assassin is derived from hashashin, or hashish smokers, a name given to the group by its foes and based on stories about their novel method of recruiting new members. In the early 13th century, the German chronicler Arnold of Lübeck revealed more about the group's mysterious leader. I shall now relate things about this elder which appear ridiculous, but which are attested to me by the evidence of reliable witnesses. This old man has by his witchcraft so bemused the men of his country that they neither worship nor believe in any god but himself. Likewise he entices them in a strange manner, with such hopes and with promises of such pleasures, with eternal enjoyment, that they prefer rather to die than to live. Many of them even, when standing on a high wall, will jump off at his nod or command, and shattering their skulls, die a miserable death. The most blessed, so he affirms, are those who shed the blood of men, and in revenge for such deeds themselves suffer death. When therefore any of them have chosen to die in this way, murdering someone by craft, and then themselves dying so blessedly in revenge for him, he himself hands them knives which are, so to speak, consecrated by this affair, and then intoxicates them with such a poison that they are plunged into ecstasy and oblivion, displays to them by his magic certain fantastic dreams full of pleasure and delights, or rather of trumpery, and promises them eternal possession of these things in reward for such deeds. The fullest account of how the assassins recruited their fanatical killers comes from Marco Polo's late 13th century travels. Moorhet is a country which the old man of the mountain dwell in former days, and the name means place of the Aram. I will tell you his whole story is related by Messer Marco Polo, who heard it from several natives of that region. The old man was called in their language Aladdin. He had caused a certain valley between two mountains to be enclosed. They turned into a garden, the largest and most beautiful, that ever was seen, filled with every variety of fruit. In it were erected pavilions and palaces, the most elegant that can be imagined, all covered with gilding and exquisite painting. There were runnels too, flowing freely with wine and milk and honey and water, and numbers of ladies, of the most beautiful damsels in the world, who could play on all manner of instruments and sung most sweetly, dancing in a manner that it was charming to behold. For the old man desired to make his people believe that this was actually paradise. So he had fashioned it after the description that Mahomet gave of his paradise, to wit, there should be a beautiful garden running with conduits of wine and milk and honey and water, full of lovely women for the delectation of all its inmates. And sure enough, the Saracens of those parts believed it was paradise. Now no man was allowed to enter the garden save those whom he intended to be his assassin. There was a fortress at the entrance to the garden, strong enough to resist all the world. There was no other way to get in. He kept at his court a number of the youths of the country, from 12 to 20 years of age, such as had a taste for soldiering. To these he used to tell tales about paradise, just as Mohammed had been wont to do, and they believed in him just as the Saracens believed in Mohammed. Then he would introduce them into his garden, some 4 or 6 or 10 at a time, having first made them drink a certain potion, which cast them into a deep sleep, and then causing them to be lifted and carried in. So when they awoke they found themselves in the garden. According to the legend that surrounded the assassins, the potion that made these young men susceptible to the suggestion that they'd visited paradise was hashish. The old man would get his potential recruits high on this, an experience they didn't understand and for which they had no cultural referent, and then introduced them to his gardens, which, as Marco Polo related, had been scrupulously designed to correspond to the Quran's descriptions of paradise, fruits, women and all. In chapter 37, verses 38 to 49 it reads, "Indeed, you disbelievers will be tasted of the painful punishment, but not the chosen servants of Allah. Those will have a provision determined, fruits, and they will be honoured in gardens of pleasure on thrones facing one another. There will be circulated among them a cup from a flowing spring, white and delicious to the drinkers. No bad effect is there in it, nor from it will they be intoxicated. And with them will be women limiting their glances, with large eyes as if they were eggs, well protected." The old man of the mountain, according to Marco Polo's account, used his young recruits' experience of paradise to manipulate them into doing his murderous bidding. When therefore they awoke and found themselves in a place so charming, they deemed that it was paradise in very truth. The ladies and damsels dallied with them to their heart's content, so that they had what young men would have, and with their own good will they never would have quitted the place. But eventually the hashish wore off and the girls were gone, and the old man of the mountain would then explain to the bewildered and disappointed young men who had been so enjoying paradise what had just happened. Now this prince, whom we call the Old One, kept his court in grand and noble style, and made those simple hill folk about him believe firmly that he was a great prophet. When he wanted one of his assassins to send on any mission, he would cause that potion whereof I spoke to be given to one of his youths in the garden, then had him carried into his palace. So when the young man awoke, he found himself in the castle, and no longer in that paradise, whereat he was not over well pleased. He was then conducted to the old man's presence, and bowed before him with great veneration, as believing himself to be in the presence of a prophet. The prince would then ask whence he came, and he would reply that he came from paradise, and that it was exactly such as Muhammad had described it in the law. This of course gave the others who stood by, who had not been admitted, the greatest desire to enter therein. This was all to induce the young men to commit murder. So when the old man would have any prince slain, he would say to such a youth, "Go thou and slay so and so, and when thou returnest, my angels shall bear thee into paradise. And should thou die, nevertheless even so will I send my angels to carry thee back to paradise." So he caused them to believe, and thus there was no order of his that they would not affront any peril to execute, for the great desire they had to get back into that paradise of his. And in this manner the Old One got his people to murder anyone whom he desired to get rid of. Thus too, the great dread that he inspired all princes withal made them become his tributaries, in order that he might abide at peace and amity with them. The old man could plausibly promise these young men, if they killed at his bidding and were killed in the process, they would enter paradise, because that same promise is in the Quran. Although they mainly killed rival Muslim leaders, assassins murdered the Latin king of Jerusalem, Conrad of Montferrat, in 1192. They became in the consciousness of the Crusaders the epitome of the ruthless and terrible fanatics against whom they were fighting. 21st century individual jihadis have frequently boasted, "We love death more than you love life." The assassins would have agreed. Meanwhile, a jihad commander was on the scene, who would turn the tide in the Holy Land decisively against the Crusaders. Shirkuh's ambitious young nephew was named Saladin. Once in control in Egypt, he began enforcing the laws subjugating Christians as dhimmis. Michael the Syrian recounted that Saladin issued an order in Egypt that Christians must always appear in public wearing a distinguishing belt as a sign of servitude, and that they could not mount a horse or mule. Saladin was to become one of the most celebrated and renowned Muslim warriors in the entire history of jihad, one of the few whose name is known in the West. In modern-day myth-making, Saladin is to individual Muslims what Al-Andalus is to Muslim politics. He has become the prototype of the tolerant, magnanimous Muslim warrior, historical proof of the nobility of Islam. In the Crusades, through Arabised, Malouf described Saladin as always affable with visitors, insisting that they stayed to eat, treating them with full honours, even if they were infidels, and satisfying all their requests. He could not bear to let someone who had come to him depart disappointed, and there were those who did not hesitate to take advantage of this quality. One day, during a truce with the Franks, the Brins, Lord of Antioch, arrived unexpectedly at Saladin's tent, and asked him to return a district that the Sultan had taken 4 years earlier, and he agreed. But he was not always so magnanimous. Saladin set out to conquer Jerusalem in 1187 in response to Crusaders under the command of Reynaud of Chatillons, taking a page from the Islamic prophet Muhammad's book and raiding caravans, in this case Muslim caravans. The rulers of the Kingdom of Jerusalem ordered Reynaud to stop, because they knew that his actions endangered the very survival of the kingdom. Yet he persisted, and finally Saladin had had enough. He struck hard. When Saladin's forces defeated the Crusaders at Hattin on the 4th of July, Independence Day, brothers and sisters, 1187, he ordered the mass execution of his Christian opponents. According to his secretary, Eddin, Saladin ordered that they should be beheaded, choosing to have them dead rather than in prison. With him was a whole band of scholars and Sufis and a certain number of devout men and ascetics. Each begged to be allowed to kill one of them and drew his sword and rolled back his sleeve. The great jihad warrior took particular satisfaction in the scene. Saladin, his face joyful, was seated on his dais. Unbelievers showed black despair. The warriors of jihad captured the true cross and displayed it in Damascus upside down. However, when Saladin recaptured Jerusalem for the Muslims in 1187, he treated the Christians with magnanimity, in sharp contrast to the behaviour of the Crusaders in 1099. Yet magnanimity was not his initial plan. He had originally intended to put all the Christians to death in the city. However, the Christian commander inside Jerusalem, Balian of Ibelin, threatened in turn to destroy the city and kill all the Muslims there before Saladin could get inside. So Saladin relented, but once inside the city, he did enslave many of the Christians who could not afford to buy their way out. Each Christian had to raise a ransom payment in order to leave the city. Those who remained, who were not enslaved, had to pay, you guessed it, brothers and sisters, the jizya. Saladin also took Acre and Jaffa, greatly reducing the Crusaders' territory. The tide had turned definitively against the Crusaders, and the end of their presence in the Middle East was only a matter of time. Alarmed by Saladin's victories, Pope Gregory VIII called the Third Crusade and won the active participation of King Henry II of England and Philip II of France, who had previously been warring against each other. But what began in a demonstration of Christian unity was doomed by Christian disunity. Also participating was Barbarossa, by now 70 years old. His title of Holy Roman Emperor, which all the successors in Charlemagne in Germany had taken, may have played well at home, but in the East it was a different story. The Byzantine emperors still considered themselves to be the sole rightful emperors of the Romans. The Roman Emperor Isaac II thus viewed the Roman Emperor Barbarossa as an upstart and a pretender. Isaac granted Frederick permission to pass with his Crusader forces through Byzantine domains, but once Frederick was there, Isaac did all he could to make his passage difficult. So offended was Isaac, Emperor of the Romans, by the appropriation of his title that he contacted Saladin himself and concluded a secret treaty with him. Isaac agreed to do everything he could to hinder Frederick's advance. As promised, provisions failed to appear, and Byzantine troops actively interfered with the Crusaders' advance. Frederick became infuriated and warned Isaac that if the harassment didn't stop, the Crusaders would attack Byzantine territory. Isaac asked for negotiations, but these became mired in arguments over who exactly was the Roman Emperor, so Frederick ultimately made good on the threat and captured Adrianople. Isaac then agreed that if the Crusaders withdrew from his city, he would provide them provisions and other aid against the Muslims. Frederick was then able to advance across Asia Minor, defeating the Turks in one battle before all came to naught. when the elderly Holy Roman Emperor drowned while crossing a river in Armenia. His crusade came to nothing. The other forces of the Third Crusade managed to recapture Acre and Jaffa, but they failed to retake Jerusalem. Saladin, meanwhile, had visions of extending his jihad far beyond the Holy Land. He understood his fight against the Crusaders as part of the larger jihad that was indeed global, and he desired to pursue that as well. His friend Bahar Eddin recalled that once, standing on the shores of the Mediterranean with Saladin, the great commander said to him, "I think that when God grants me victory over the rest of the Middle East, I shall divide my territories, make a will state my wishes, and set sail to their far-off lands, and pursue the Franks there, so as to free the earth of anyone who does not believe in God or die in the attempt." Saladin did not live to realise his aspiration to take the jihad to the lands of the Franks. He died in Damascus in 1193. Other Muslims, however, had the same goal, would pursue it indefatigably. In April 1213, 9 years after the Fourth Crusade went disastrously awry, with the Crusaders getting involved in a Byzantine dynastic dispute and ending up sacking Constantinople, Pope Innocent III called a fifth. In his bull, Quia Maya, he articulated the reasons for the conflict as he saw them. In the virtual obverse of Saladin's aspirations for global jihad, Innocent noted that the Christian peoples in fact held almost all the Saracen provinces up to the time of Gregory, that is, Pope Gregory the Great, who reigned from 590 to 604. But since then, Innocent continued, a son of perdition has arisen, the false prophet Muhammad, who seduced many men from the truth by worldly enticements and the pleasures of the flesh. He thought that the end of Islam was approaching. Although Muhammad's treachery has prevailed up to the present day, we nevertheless put our trust in the Lord, who has already given us a sign that good is to come, that the end of this beast is approaching, whose number, according to the revelation of St. John, will end in 666 years, of which nearly 600 have passed. Nonetheless, it was imperative to resist the Saracens, and in addition to the former great and grave injuries which the treacherous Saracens have inflicted on our Redeemer, on account of our offences, the same perfidious Saracens have recently built a fortified stronghold to confound the Christian name on Mount Thabor, where Christ revealed to his disciples a vision of his future glory. By means of this fortress they think they will easily occupy the city of Acre, which is very near them, and then invade the rest of that land without any obstructive resistance, since it is almost entirely devoid of forces or supplies. This crusade too was ultimately unsuccessful, as were subsequent forays. The warriors of jihad from the Mamluk Sultanate took Jerusalem in 1244. The remaining Crusader kingdoms were in serious peril, and there was no help in sight. The jihadis pursued their quarry ruthlessly. In 1268, when the jihad forces of the Mamluk Sultan, Baybars, took Antioch from the Crusaders, Baybars was annoyed to find that the Crusader ruler, Count Bohemond VI, had already left the city.